This is the Danger Close podcast, Beyond the Books with me, Jack Carr. Welcome to the Danger Close podcast, an Ironclad original presented by Navy Federal Credit Union. My guest today is my friend Samuel Katz. He's written something like 40 books on terrorism, special operations, focused primarily on the Middle East. His latest book is called No Shadows in the Desert. He's also written hundreds of articles on terrorism and special operations. You can find out more about him at samuelkatzonline.com. And now, without further ado, Samuel Katz. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this today. I sincerely.
Anything for you.
Oh, well, I have, as you can, I don't have all your books because how many have you written now?
I have no idea.
Yeah, it's a lot. This isn't even half, I don't think. But this is quite a few, as those watching can see. But what's the general ballpark? What do you think? Not counting journal. I mean, if you count journal articles and that sort of thing, there's no way probably
over
keep track.
20 books and hundreds of articles.
Jeez, amazing. And obviously there's some October 7th. You've been studying the region, Israel in particular, terrorism, for most of your adult life.
Yes.
I wanted to get your perspective on a few things. First, where are you right now, and where were you on October 7th when you started getting the news?
I'm here in New York City. I was planning to make my travel arrangements for Israel for the end of the month for a book that I was commissioned to write, details to follow. And
Okay.
I woke up and found my wife talking to her parents, telling them to grab their medicine and run. And her parents are in Israel. And I had no idea what she was talking about. And then I put the news on it at 6:30 in the morning, and it was like, holy shit. There we go again. But this, no one knew initially how bad it was, and nobody could fathom how bad it would be.
Yeah. How did they make it okay to get to someplace safer anyway?
Yeah, I mean they're elderly, and they've been through this dance before, but going in and out of up the stairs, down the stairs, into the hallway, down into the bomb shelter is not really a way that people in a functioning democracy, a Western country, should have to live. Nobody should have to live that way.
Yeah. It's so heartbreaking seeing those images come out of Israel. You spent like we talked about, you've written all these books, most of them on terrorism in that region of the world. Did you, in all of that study and experience that you have, did you know that something like this was going to come eventually, based on the policies of essentially containment and tolerable levels of violence coming out of Gaza and coming out of Lebanon from Hezbollah? Did you know that something was going to happen eventually? Or did you think, hey, this policy of tolerable levels of violence can last for quite a while? Well, what were your thoughts on that?
Well, I'll answer your second question first. The situation was so untenable that there have been so many operations against Hamas and its rockets that nobody can remember all their names. And status quo is wonderful if you're working at a company at that steady growth or whatever. But in dealing with a movement that only thinks of your eradication, it was wishful thinking. And as you know better than most, when you're planning an operation or trying to wage war, praying for the best usually means the worst will happen.
Yeah.
So I could not imagine the scale of the bloodshed of the massacre. And I think that Hamas didn't plan for the scale of the bloodshed and the massacre. And I think there are 2 points kind of how this developed. It was a complete failure from the top down, in every level, political, military, intelligence, you name it. It was a perfect storm of opportunity for Hamas, the music festival happening, it being a holiday, and Israelis were more or less at war with one another. The political situation in the country was going into a very bad direction. And I think that Israeli planners, Israeli tacticians, intelligence individuals, did not think that the enemy, if it's from the north or from the south, would do anything that could unify the country. And they did. So historically, Hamas has used potential and real oncoming peace treaties as a chance to go to war, a chance to do something really horrible. In 1994, about a week or so before Jordan and Israel were going to sign the peace treaty, Hamas kidnapped a young soldier and held him for close to a week until Israeli commandos tried to storm the location. The operation failed. The raid commander and the hostage were killed, but the Hamas wanted to try and torpedo the peace talks, but they didn't succeed. Here, Israel and Saudi Arabia were getting very close. Israeli ministers were attending conferences in Riyadh, unheard of, unthinkable. And if Israel and Saudi Arabia would have come together in a peace treaty, that Middle Eastern reality, that global reality, because it would have sort of taken away the Islamic argument against Israel, would have really rendered Hamas and the Iranian proxies to stories of a bygone day. They were no longer relevant. And relevance for a terrorist army is all important.
Hmm. Do you think that those talks, agreements that were essentially on the brink of coming to fruition, are those temporarily derailed? Are those completely derailed, or does this provide, like you said, opportunity for those to go through? And with, I mean, you have the Gulf states, obviously, and then you have Iran, Israel, U.S. There's a lot of, and then not to mention Russia, China, and trading partners, Iran, China. That dynamic. Do you think it's an opportunity for the talks to go through at a difficult time?
Well, having traveled in the Middle East, having written about the Middle East, and having known Middle Easterners most of my adult life, optimism is not something that you want to go to the bank with. However, and I think that this is important, the Israelis are now planning something for Gaza. This is without question. This is not revealing any secrets. There are 300,000 soldiers amassed on the frontiers with Gaza to do something. What happens the day after is what will sort of define what the Middle East will be. And I think that there is an enormous opportunity for the Saudi-Israeli peace talks, understanding, to move faster rather than slower. I think that this is an opportunity for people interested in a newer Middle East to seize the narrative. And it depends on a lot of things. And it depends if the Palestinians want to go along with it. And Hamas will be destroyed or disfigured. I mean, I think that that's a given. If that message is destroyed or disfigured with it, meaning that the religious fire to annihilate the Jewish people, to go from, what the saying is for a lot of the protesters on universities, which is a topic that we could spend hours on, when people screaming from river to sea, Palestine will be free, which is basically means that every Jew inside the country is going to be butchered. If that paradigm can change somehow by freeing the Palestinians from Hamas, then there's a chance for the future. And the chance is going to depend on the Israeli ability to forgive and forget, which I don't know if that's possible.
Yeah, Golda Meir had a quote. I think it was 50. It was one in the late 50s, one in the mid 60s, and I'll mix them up here. But the general gist was, we can forgive you for killing our sons and daughters. We cannot forgive you for forcing us to kill yours. Something along those.
Absolutely.
It's very powerful.
There
I
was
don't
there
have.
was a I forget one of the networks, but there was a professor at Princeton who said, the world will be better when beautiful Israeli babies and beautiful Palestinian babies share an equal footing. Well, I think that was such a Pollyanna way of describing the world. You can tell he spent most of his life behind a desk. The world will be a better place when the Palestinians cherish their beautiful children the same way that the Jewish parents cherish theirs, and not
Yeah, that was
expose
another.
their kids to constant conflict, for a conflict that in reality, when you think about it on realistic terms, it is impossible for them to win.
Yeah. Yeah, there's another one that was similar to that. I think it was Golda Meir as well, who said that peace will come when Palestinian parents love their children more than they hate the Jews.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh man, we've been studying terrorism for a long time, our intelligence community, military side of the house. And from me looking in, for as a person who has been studying this my whole life and reading about this my whole life as well, I had this sense, some of it reinforced by popular culture, but much of it from the pages of history. The Israeli army standing up to larger armies, more technically advanced militaries, what they have done on the intelligence side of the house to keep Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. There was this aura that both the military and the intelligence services in Israel had, and there's let's say Mossad, Shin Bet, and Amam. So it's like CIA, FBI, and military intelligence, essentially, and they had this aura, not of invincibility, but I would say a mystique about where they had people and where they were getting their intelligence, what they could accomplish. That seems to have taken a big hit on October 7th. The intelligence side of the house,
Took a
and the
torpedo to the
military.
bow.
Yeah.
There's several factors. A, you're never as good as your hype. B, you're only as good as your last screw up. And the problem with Gaza was the same as the problem that existed in the West Bank during the Second Intifada that prompted the Israelis to go in 2002 after the Passover massacre. And that is, they didn't really have eyes and ears in the Gaza Strip that were reliable, because it was a closed off piece of land, and it was very difficult for Israeli agents, Israeli intelligence, to operate there. There was an operation that was revealed to the press when a very secret intelligence unit was compromised at a roadblock, and the commander was killed a few years back. His identity is still secret. And it showed the difficulty of having reliable eyes and ears on target. And if you don't have that human eye-to-eye element and you rely on technology, all of those bells and whistles of eavesdropping and signal intelligence and knowing what people are thinking because their phones are on, that has a danger, because people could say whatever they want on the phone if they're not revealing themselves, if they're trying to fool you. But if you're sitting in a cafe somewhere in Gaza looking at someone eye to eye, you can tell if he's lying or not. You can assess the situation. And the Israelis lack that. That was denied to them. So they had to rely on other measures. And when you rely on technology well, let's put it this way, every army in history that has hid behind a wall has been defeated.
Mm. Interesting.
And the Israelis are no different. They hid behind fences and all sorts of technological means and balloons to monitor. And the Palestinians continuously tested it. They tested it with large demonstrations near the border to see how close they could go. Um, they tried it with all sorts of ways by throwing balloons over the fence to see if they could land and they could set fire to agricultural fields. So all these little probing actions on their own were just benign. But in the larger sense, they created an offensive intelligence picture for the Palestinians that gave them a very clear-cut idea as to what's going on. Also, the Israelis tried to give the Palestinians a slightly better life by letting about 20,000 come and work in Israel. Well, a lot of them worked in the agricultural settlements that were targeted. So you had these people earning salaries who were eyes and ears on Israeli targets, and they provided intelligence. So it, that on its own was a perfect storm. You add the political chaos in Israel, where a government of a very right-wing government was elected or created a coalition. A lot of the individuals in that coalition were inept, incapable, dishonest, and they were leading the country in a direction where the backbone of the country, people who served in the military, the defense element of the people's army, of the citizenry, were out in protest. We have to remember that in February, I believe, the Army Chief of Staff, himself an operator, former operator, wanted to speak to the Prime Minister, stating that the political disarray in the country, the judicial overhaul that Netanyahu's government was trying to pass, was weakening the defense establishment, and Netanyahu refused to see him. And when the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, wanted to see him and speak to him about the same thing, Gallant being a former commander of Flotilla 13, the Israeli naval SEALs, Netanyahu fired him. And that firing led to the massive protests every week. So if you have the government saying that the people in the defense hierarchy are left-wing traitors and they can't be, or they shouldn't be believed, it's going to be very hard for intel to find its way forward, up, and to reach the decision makers. There was a report that Israel's Channel 12 showed a couple of days ago, where they spoke to some young conscripts, some female soldiers who worked in the observation towers opposite Gaza. And they've been reporting for weeks and months that there's unusual activity on the Palestinian side of the fence. And that material fell on deaf ears. So as you know, I'm not saying anything new to you, but as you know, if the people on the top aren't listening to the intel is useless.
I wonder if that's the same observation post I read about, manned mostly by female soldiers that were massacred fairly early on, that didn't have the proper weapons to defend themselves, the proper security to defend themselves. I wonder if that's the same group that was reporting on all. We'll find out in the months and years ahead, of course, as more information becomes available. But it's the same. If that's the same observation group, area, headquarters, FOB, whatever they call them over there, that was reporting this unusual activity that got hit and got massacred because they didn't have the proper security in place. So it's heartbreaking. Yeah,
well, they weren't prepared to handle 1,500, 2,000 terrorists.
Yeah. That's something else I want to ask you about in a second. But going back to SIGINT and more technical means of gathering intelligence, it seems like outcome being a bit different, but similar to at the end of the Cold War, as technology on our side is starting to increase leaps and bounds, and we descend into the Cold War, and there are talks about what to do and where to allocate resources going forward. And the human side of the house, the human intelligence collection, kind of took a second place to some of this more technical intelligence and satellites and everything else that was going on at the time at the end of the Cold War. And of course, that came back to haunt the United States. It seems like maybe something similar happened here, but not by choice. Seems like because of a policy that is put in place that essentially Israel out of Gaza is governing itself. Hamas takes power in there, and Israel is not in there at all to be able to do the human collection, but they can collect technically, which of course Hamas knows. So what do? Well, you adapt, and then you start communicating in ways or spreading disinformation maybe on the ways they know that your enemy is listening to, and then talking using some of the more traditional type of tradecraft to communicate that can't be collected by a sensor. So it seems like there's some similarities to the end of the Cold War.
Yes, it's a fatal mistake to think that your enemy isn't adapting to your moves and your overconfidence and your inability to gain human access inside. I mean, to think that for some reason a few good-paying jobs inside Israel would change the Hamas charter or sway the Iranians or the Qataris from supporting the military infrastructure that was allowed to be built in Gaza was naive. And sadly, but there's another component that needs to be discussed. The in 2014, the last time the Israelis went into Gaza physically, Israel did not have a large window to achieve its military objectives. Of course, Israel really didn't have military objectives, but that's another argument. And there was an incident similar to the hospital incident that happened when the world was outraged by in this case, an Islamic Jihad rocket that the Palestinians turned into propaganda. But in 2014, an Israeli strike hit the UN school, a UN school in Gaza. And because the UN school, which was supposed to be off limits, was home to a command and control section, it was where Hamas stored rockets and explosives and prepared suicide bombers, a legitimate military target. When the Israelis hit it, President Obama said that he was appalled. When the US president says that he's appalled, it limits your freedom of action. It endangers your soldiers. And I think the difference here is that, and sadly, 1,400 people had to be butchered, but it allowed the world to see Hamas for what it was, what it is, and what needs to be done to eradicate it. And I think here the Israelis have a bit more freedom of action, a lot more freedom of action, to do what needs to be done, to basically remove Iranian terror hubs, proxy hubs, from its frontiers. We couldn't live with it with Iran, both in Canada and Mexico. And Israel can't live with it really in Gaza and southern Lebanon.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see and observe the difference in reporting from institutions generally, specific people, differences between how Ukraine is reported on and how Israel is being reported on, meaning calls for ceasefire, restraint, cycles of violence, understanding when it comes to Israel. Those were absent for the most part, generally, when it comes to those same institutions reporting on Ukraine. And I'm wondering how you see the difference in that reporting.
Well, I could give you an academic analysis, but the reality is that Jews in the rest of the world are perceived differently. There weren't mass protests in Times Square supporting Putin. There are protests in Times Square supporting Hamas. There are protests in Los Angeles. There are protests at the Ivy League institutions. There are networks in this country that refuse to call the psychopaths, the sociopaths that carried out the butchery, terrorists. They call them militants. A militant is someone who puts ketchup on a hot dog, It's not someone who beheads a baby. These are stone cold killers. These are individuals who've been reared their entire lives for this moment. And we can go into the politics that created it, the money that went to educate and brainwash and indoctrinate them. But until that moral clarity is established, um, anytime the Israelis take out someone of value, someone with blood on his hands, there'll be people who will be saying that the response is disproportionate and that there needs to be rationality and morality in what Israelis do.
Yeah, you don't hear that coming from those same people about Ukraine for the most part,
No.
generally. And it is very telling. It's extremely telling. This has highlighted, I think, a lot of anti-Semitism
You
across the
think?
world,
You think?
and, it's out there. I mean, not like not veiled. That's what I mean. I mean, not veiled, where maybe that was the case before. Not generally, not so much anymore. These are very specific incident, and they're proud of it. It's extremely telling and heartbreaking, considering
It's
Hamas.
horrific, and it suits a political and an abhorrent narrative. And the anti-Semitism has been there since the time of man. But recently, in recent years, the anti-Semitism has been festering, a growing boil everywhere. And the slaughter of Jews became the pinprick that let all the cancer out of the tumor. And people are unapologetic. It's horrible. And I think that this is a danger because it it unites crazies on both sides of the political spectrum, and it really inhibits what Israel has to do. I think that what 9/11 taught us, and a lesson we didn't learn, what ISIS taught us, another lesson we haven't learned, is that, and what this hopefully will teach us, is this is a battle of civilization. This is a battle of how differences are settled, of how differences are allowed to be manipulated by powers, either religion or nation states, and how people are proxies and fodder in catastrophic endgames that could lead to tens of thousands of dead. I mean, I have a New York City high school education, so forgive my math. But what happened in Israel was about 15 or 20 9/11s, if you do the proportionality of it. What would the United States have done? You know, in Great Britain on the BBC, there's a great amount of talk about rationality and morality. Um, but I don't remember people in Britain wondering about that when Dresden had to be firebombed to bring that war to an end. And I think that common sense has left the building. And sadly, good people have died and will have to die as a result.
And at this time, 2023, there are so many more tools out there that one can use to manipulate a populace visually, using essentially marketing techniques to manipulate a populace, control behaviors, thoughts. Even it's a remarkable time to be alive. Meaning, you have to put in the work these days, much more so, I think, than you did in the past. It's always been a responsibility of the citizenry to be informed, understand the history behind an issue. We haven't always been good at it, but now you have to do that for these future generations. You have to put that requisite time, energy, and effort into the study of history. What led us to this point, so you can better understand it, so you can cast a vote, so that you can raise your children to be also informed citizens. And it's just a tough time to do that with all those inputs coming in, all those ways that you can be manipulated. And it's tough, particularly when it comes to this issue, when it comes to Israel in particular. Israel highlights how
Yes.
important it is to
It's
sift
par for the
through.
crazies. Technology is overwhelming us, and it's made us as thick as a brick. I mean, look
Yeah.
at the hospital that was allegedly hit, that created political and turmoil and violence. The claims were 500 to 1,000 killed, the hospital destroyed. It was an errant Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket, and now they're saying that only 10 or 50 people have been killed. But think of how many people could have died as a result of misinformation and sloppy reporting.
Yep. Oh yeah, it's that CNN effect, and again going back to Ukraine, when they tell us that Russia is targeting hospitals, that's what comes out in the news. Here you have Israel doing its due diligence to check to see, did we do this? And the answer was no. Hamas says it was. So what do you see in the news? Predominantly, you see the Hamas story. It's fascinating. Um, it's yeah. Anyway, moving on from that, though, going back to Israel intelligence and military, there was also this image that I had growing up, and it was black and white photos from, let's say, late 40s, early 50s, 60s of the citizen soldier in Israel, a woman standing guard in her kibbutz with an old Mauser bolt action rifle type of a standing tall, standing proud, ready to defend her homeland and her family, her life. And now we have what we saw on October 7th, those same kibbutzes getting overrun, and an IDF that wasn't there to respond, and the citizens also, for the most part, not armed to defend themselves, like in those photos that I saw growing up in the magazines and in encyclopedias and anywhere I could find anything on military, that region of the world. There was that vision of the citizen soldier standing out there with a less technically advanced weapon system, standing against almost impossible odds. That we didn't see that. All these years that have passed, something, whether it's proliferation of more gun laws, more control by the government, more trust that the government's going to protect you, that this intelligence service is going to protect you, this military is going to protect you, but taking those arms away from the citizens seems to have played into this, unfortunately.
I think the citizens, many were armed, many defended themselves, but when Hamas attacked, they also hit the army bases, which the Israelis weren't quite ready for. And the army bases, again, it was a holiday, it was a Saturday, people were on leave. They hit at the most vulnerable time imaginable. And the army bases were fighting for their own survival and unable to be the quick reaction force. So what happened was that all of the tier 1 units in Israel that had their readiness group rushed down there as fast as humanly possible and engaged the terrorists. So if you look at the dead, the 160 plus soldiers who were killed and 51 policemen were killed, you see officers from the General Staff Reconnaissance Unit, Sayeret Matkal. You see officers and operators from Flotilla 13. From all of the 9 members of the Yamam were killed. So you see all these individuals from the very elite units race down there, and they helped rescue the army bases that were inundated with 300-400 terrorists, heavily armed, well stocked with communications, and the terrorists fought fiercely, and the operators had to fight twice as fierce, and there were 30 or 40 battles going on simultaneously. Command and control were very, very difficult. The IDF released footage of the Flotilla 13 rescue of 250 soldiers from a base. Soldiers didn't sleep with their weapons. The weapons were in the armory. By the time the alarm sounded, it was too late. The analogies to Pearl Harbor are accurate. It was, with everything considered, it was the worst of all combinations for Israel and the most opportune for the Palestinians. The Palestinians breached the fence, the border, above ground by the sea and underground. And once the holes in the fence existed, every forgive the term, swinging dick in Gaza with an AK-47 came over the fence. And now you had thousands who were inside those communities. And then once they were there, you had people coming over to loot, to rob, to steal, to mutilate. So the number of the number of individuals that came out was a human invasion, and it had to be beaten back. And this wasn't the scenario that the Israelis had war games for. That specific scenario they had always thought would come from the north, from Hezbollah.
Mm-hmm.
Because they figured that Hezbollah was more military capable to carry out that sort of invasion. And they figured that Hamas had become reliant on homemade and Iranian supplied rockets and would not risk such an operation.
Yeah, it's by the very definition of response, when you're talking about military and police responding to an incident, it's already happened. And for me, I'm curious if there will be calls, particularly in the Gaza envelope right there, for those families, those kibbutzes there, to take more ownership of their own defense. And if the government will have to make it easier for them to get the sort of weapons they need to defend against an attack like this, particularly if they're right there. And the army has proved that they are responding, which means they are coming after the fact. So I'm very curious to see what that is in the aftermath of this. It seems like some steps could be taken to allow the citizens to better defend themselves.
Well, there was Israel before October 7th, and there'll be an Israel after October 7th. There'll be two very different countries.
Yeah. You mentioned hostages earlier, and there was a hostage taken who was he was taken 5 years, exchanged eventually for over 5 years, over 1,000 prisoners in that exchange, and it shows how much value Israel places on life, that they would be willing to exchange one soldier for, I think it was 1,200, but over 1,000 anyway. Has that model now shifted, do you think, in the aftermath of this, and all the reporting that you've done, all the writing that you've done, all the research that you've done on counterterrorism units, intelligence services? How do you think the hostage situation plays into this, when you have I forget exactly how many they've said, I think so 200 plus hostages spread around Gaza, possibly tunnels, also Americans, Europeans. I'm sure we have our counter-terrorist forces down there, hostage rescue units down there close by, ready to go. I'm sure that some units out of Europe have done the same. How does that play into all this?
Hamas historically has loved taking hostages. One of their first acts was in the late 80s, the kidnapping of an Israeli soldier and hiding his remains, making him simply disappear, and holding the location of the remains hostage. Then Hamas moved to the incident that I mentioned before, the kidnapping of the soldier right before the Jordanian-Israeli peace treaty. And then the incident that you're talking about, the kidnapping of Gilad Shalit in 2006. Israel released 1,200 terrorists. Many of them were guilty of the most heinous suicide, planning the most heinous suicide bombings. It was a painful ordeal. And I think that the willingness to negotiate gave Hamas more or less a store credit to think of kidnapping. However, I don't think Hamas intended to kidnap 200 people. I think many of the people that came in after the initial assault were seized by the second and third tier because it was the thing to do. And because you can imagine that rescuing 200 people is a nightmare. Looking after 200 people is just as much of a nightmare. And it creates all sorts of public relation nightmares for Hamas. The seizing of grandmothers and babies. Lord knows what they've done to the young women who they've taken into Gaza, because we know what they did to the ones that were in Israel. They raped them, they gang raped them, they mutilated them, they burned them alive. So one can only imagine the horrors that they're going through. And I think that the lag time now between airstrikes and ground operation is probably an effort to try and locate as many as the hostages as can be located, or to create some sort of means by which there's a bit of give and take, perhaps humanitarian aid and medicine for the people of Gaza, and then the release of women and children, something. It also gives the boots on the ground, and I know that people from your community aren't really boots, they're shadows, but it gives them the ability to sort of coordinate matters. I mean, it's colossal what has to be done, considering that you have people from numerous nationalities. I don't want to speculate on who's there, but I'm sure that they're there, and they're trying to figure this out, and they're trying to do this in a way where you can rescue these people. And again, hostage rescue is a manpower eater in terms of the rescue force, the backup team, the extraction force. I mean, we're talking about thousands and thousands of operators that have to be involved when you have 200 people. I don't envy the individuals that have to plan all this, and the operators themselves are facing a challenge I don't think that has ever existed in the history of warfare.
Yeah, and I know I only have a few minutes left with you, and I sincerely appreciate you taking this time. But I wanted to ask you about Hezbollah, because it obviously plays into a lot of the books you have written, and the history of Hezbollah, its creation, what it did in the 80s, how it's morphed, its leadership, how it's been targeted. You are very well versed in all of this, especially when it comes to Hezbollah here. What do you see playing out in the north? And obviously we have, I think it's two carrier battle groups going into the Med. I wouldn't be surprised if something's coming up in Persian Gulf, Straits or Hormuz area from the Indian Ocean or Pacific or somewhere, to put pressure on Iran to try to keep Hezbollah out of this fight. But how do you see the Hezbollah side of this playing out?
If I had a magic 8 ball, I would any guess that I would give would be wrong. So I'll give you just my opinion. I think that Iran must have given the blessing to this. I'm sure that a lot of the tactics and material were supplied by Hezbollah. I believe that Hamas must have thought that if they strike a large strike at Israel, that Hezbollah would join in. And I think that Hezbollah took a property beating in 2006 in the Second Lebanon War. They lost money, they lost property, and they lost a lot of goodwill of the people that maybe supported them. I think that Hezbollah enjoys being in parliament in Lebanon. They enjoy their narco trafficking profits, and they don't really want to risk it. So they're kind of trying to kick Israel in the kneecaps every now and then with rocket fire to see how it escalates. I think that I think that the carrier groups are to allow Israel the freedom to take care of Gaza first. And Hezbollah will have to be dealt with. And I think that Israel has all the moral imperative and national security urgency to eradicate Hezbollah as well. The only question is this going to be 1967 or 1973? 1967, that Israel preempts an attack to take out the targets on its terms, or 1973, where it has to take a hit for world sympathy and then deal with it and be victorious on its own. And that's always a political consideration for Israeli prime ministers.
Yeah. And yeah, Hezbollah up north, I've read that they have upwards of 150,000 rockets pointed at Israel, with this paradigm shift that occurred on the 7th. It seems like that Israel will not wait until there's 300,000 rockets pointed at them before they take action. It just seems like that from the outside looking in anyway. I
Well,
don't know, you would know better.
they don't have rockets. They have ballistic missiles. They have guided
Yeah.
missiles, and they can reach almost anywhere in Israel. So it's a completely different story. And I think that President Biden and the world leaders, especially in the West, have realized that a war that can spread, allowing Iran or its proxies to dictate when and how it starts, truly endangers global security. And I think that with the Russians preoccupied in Ukraine and the Chinese economy sort of not doing well, that this is not the time to placate the Iranians. They too have shown their true hand, no matter how many times governments around the world have tried to whitewash them. And this will have to be dealt with sooner rather than later, and much better to handle this before the Iranians are a nuclear power.
You know, in all the research that you've done over all these years and all these books that you have written right here, when it comes to dealing with terrorist organizations, whether it's from within a country or an insurgency from inside a country, or it's expeditionary counterinsurgency going overseas to deal with it elsewhere because an attack came from another country. What are some of the lessons that you have gleaned from all this research and talking to all the people that you have spoken with, and all the study that you have done into these specific operations? Which one have been successful? Which ones have not been successful? Which ones have been successful at the outset, seemingly, but have resulted in second and third order effects that were unanticipated, that actually hurt the country even more? When you look at all of that, what are some of the lessons that you take if you were advising a military leader or a prime minister or a president when it comes to dealing with these sorts of organizations that specifically deliberately target civilians, women, children, not military targets? What are those lessons that you would pass on after all these years of work and study?
I think that the lesson that can be learned is that you cannot live with them, adjacent to them, or allow them to become sanitized in the media. That is a danger. Israel has mounted thousands of counter-terrorist operations. The U.S. has mounted thousands of counter-terrorist operations, but that's a band-aid. Unless the people at the top, the people who finance them, the people who train them, the people who arm them, are stopped as well, and all their rage, all their religious fury, all of their political gripes are contained where they cannot spread into violence, then you've won. But as long as terrorists have a voice, have the means, and have the ability to hold the world hostage, dictate events, dictate non-state players, the world is going to be a horribly dangerous place. And as social media has expanded and technology has expanded, they now have a real-time global audience. Yesterday was the anniversary of the GSG-9 rescue at Mogadishu. That wasn't done with news anchors embedded at the airport terminal. You learned about it the following day in the New York Times. The removal of distance between events and ramifications is incredibly dangerous. And I think that political leaders have to figure out how to return that distance so that we're not receiving raw information, because that runs risks of being completely false, and like we saw with the hospital and the errant rocket, of sparking bloodshed that was completely unnecessary, based on a lie, based on a reporter eager to have a scoop.
Yeah. Well, I thank you so much for taking all this time. I always enjoy talking to you. I learn so much every time we talk, and from reading all your books. Is the latest one still? It's so hard to keep up with you because you write so much Is the latest one still No Shadows in the Desert, or did I miss one?
That's the latest. I am working on one that you will be the first to know, and I'll shoot you a message in private. I think you'll like it. And Fred Burton and I are always working together and conspiring. So our efforts continue.
Wonderful. And Fred, of course, dear friend of ours. So people should pick up this. They should read everything, but pick up No Shadows in the Desert for sure. And when you mentioned Fred Burton right here, this Beirut Rules is such a fantastic book because of, yes, the history, yes, the lessons, but also the context that it provides you in looking at that region. So for sure, pick up these books. And thank you so much for taking this time. I really appreciate your insights, and looking forward to your next project. And please reach out if you need anything.
Again, anything for you. Thank you so much for everything you do. And I hope to have the chance to speak to you soon.
Sounds great. Take care. Thank you for tuning in to the Danger Close podcast, an Ironclad original presented by Navy Federal Credit Union. To find out more about Samuel Katz, go to samuelkatzonline.com. Follow him on the social channels from there. Pick up his books, and be sure to pick up his latest, No Shadows in the Desert. You can find me at Jack Carr USA on the social channels. OfficialJackCarr.com is the website. Click on shop in the upper right-hand corner for the merch. And if you got something out of this conversation, be sure and leave a 5-star rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. Until the next time, take care out there. Stay safe. Be strong. Keep fighting.